I'm Ian Goldin. I'm the Professor of Globalization and Development at Oxford, and I have 3 research groups, including groups working on future technological trends. And so it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome Azeem to be talk through many of the issues which I'm sure we are all grappling with in our minds, including whether technological change is indeed exponential and what does that mean. So it's delightful to have you here. Azeem is not only a very thoughtful, deep thinker, did his PP at Oxford, has gone on to start a newsletter which has over 200,000 subscribers, Exponential podcast with similar name, and has also been a serial entrepreneur, has started businesses which have been incredibly successful. And I'm always in awe of people that can combine good ideas with actual good business sense and effectiveness. So tremendous. This book is extremely well written too. So well done for writing a book which is not only deeply illuminating and original, but also the prose is very widely accessible. And I think everyone will find it a very, very easy and attractive and engaging read for that reason, but with very deep and complex issues that I grapples with. Azeem, perhaps we could begin by you introducing the book, take about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation about it.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I have to go and find the clicker, which I think is over here. I'll get started. I hope, Ian, you don't mind if I stand up.
No, absolutely.
I tend to gesticulate, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And it was a real pleasure for me to put Oxford Martin School on my slides, because I think, Ian, the team you've built here, the research many of the people in the school have done, Carl is in the front here, but also Eric Beinhocker, Doreen Farmer, Penny Mealy, Michael Osborne as well, have really inspired much of the thinking that went into my book. So huge thank you to the Martin School. The reason behind the book was that after nearly 30 years in the technology industry, I'd started to see a lot of issues cropping up and starting to see some connections between those issues, between technology change and how it was reshaping industries, how it was reshaping labor markets, geopolitics. And I wanted to try to tell a story that was interdisciplinary, that talked from the ground up of the technologies and from the top down about the systems. Now, I'm a practitioner. I spent 25 over the last 25 years building these things as opposed to being an academic. So I think I brought with that the lens of practice as well as the lens of theory. And the book has had interesting response. I wanted to share my 1-star reviews from Amazon with you, but predominantly the one on the left, which is a 1-star, left-wing slant. It is false advertising to sell a book without revealing the political bias of the author. Unless you love the political left, do not purchase this, full of the usual left-wing claims and slanted viewpoints. So it has actually mostly had a great reception. So we had the real critics. So thank you, Ian, for your great words. And Carlota Perez, who's an intellectual hero of mine, sent me a note saying if she was enjoying it. And the last week or two, Financial Times and Times described it as one of their books of the year for 2021. So the question is, what is this book really about? And I said it's a systems analysis of what I think is going on right now. And this really is the core of the argument. The core of the argument starts with presenting 2, I think, fundamental axioms that, again, the Martin School knows better than anyone. The first is that we live in a complex socio-technical system, that our political economy, our society emerges from the interplay of technologies and rules and culture, and those things actually shape the world in which we live. And the second is that technology is not something that is as deterministic. It is not something that arrives like a bolt of lightning from the heavens that can't be shaped by us. It is actually created by us, and we can shape it. So those are two early points that I make in the preface, the forward of the book. But then the heart of the argument follows this rough flowchart, which is that The first of all is that we are in a time of technology change that is driven by general purpose technologies, and that for the first time in history, really, we have general purpose technologies that are improving at exponential rates, by which I mean on a price performance basis, they improve by 10, 20, 30% per annum over a compounded period of time. Now, we have had moments of general purpose technologies many times in the past. I mean, the printing press is a great example of that. The wheel is another good example. And more recently, between the 1870s and 1910 period, we had the arrival of the internal combustion engine, electricity, and the telephone. And what we know about general purpose technologies is that they reshape economies, and with the reshaping of economies, they reshape our social norms and the way in which our societies operate. My contention is that we have a moment of change that is driven by a new set of general purpose technologies that are improving very, very rapidly. The impact of their rapid improvement is related to the second component of the argument, which is that our institutions adapt in a more linear, slow-paced fashion. And the reason they do that, I explain in various parts of the book, is partly related to our own psychology. So for many good reasons, we have been adapted to deal with linear rather than exponential change. And we've just gone through, or we are going through, this pandemic, and there was a moment when the virus is spreading at an exponential rate, and we would see politicians, and probably ourselves and our neighbors, completely guessing where the virus would be the next week, getting that completely wrong. And that builds up into how institutions, I think, tend to deal with change. I mean, in the root of the word institution comes from the Latin word to stand. And so you have a notion that's definitional, that institutions should not just move with the breeze. If they moved with the breeze, they would be ephemeral or crazes. They wouldn't be institutions. And so the intersection between these fast-changing technologies and the potentials of those technologies and the institutions of the real world leaves us with this gap, which I call the exponential gap. Now, the reason institutions are important is that institutions are the regulatory mechanisms of our everyday lives. They can be very, very informal. One of my favorite informal institutions is, if you've ever played Monopoly, there's this unwritten rule that says that if you get a fine, it goes into the center of the board, and whoever lands on free parking gets all the money. That's not in the rule book, but that is an institution, and if you find someone who disagrees with that, that makes the game of Monopoly even more miserable than it otherwise would have been. But you also have very, very formal institutions, and those institutions could be tax codes, they could be things that are not simply tax codes, but they can be mechanisms of governance that have sort of a physical imposing presence. You know, we do this with the UN building in New York. So institutions are very, very helpful as a means of guiding our everyday life. And actually, without institutions, in this sort of broad context of the formal and the informal, life would be really complicated because we would negotiate everything a priori. You know, we would arrive at the traffic light and be negotiating whether red means go or red means stop because we have decided to dispense with that institution. So the exponential gap, though, simply put, is that technology, I contend, is improving at this sort of rate, and our institutions move linearly, and the space in between is the gap. And it is that analytic that I use to identify fragmentation and strain in many, many different aspects of society. And that what we need to think about is, how do we figure out how to close that gap, how to narrow the gap between how the institutions regulate the world and how the technologies are now shaping it. And I hint at this towards the end of the book, that what I actually see is not little pinpricks of light that are discontinuous, but rather a need for a systematic institutional overhaul and a reimagining of how our institutions operate, that we've gone through a period of time starting in the 1870s and really coming to an end in about 2011, 2012, which was the moment that the largest companies in the world stopped being oil companies and car companies and electricity companies and started being data companies. That marks a real turning point for a reimagining of these institutions. So I talk about the general purpose technologies, and I'll just say a little about each of them. The first is the computer. So the computer chip and the availability of computing power in our economies has been on this exponential clip since the 1960s and potentially even before, that was sort of descriptively described by something called Moore's Law, which essentially has said that every year we get about 45% more processing power for the same cost, and that compounds year after year, and it's why the computing power that you have in the smartphone you no longer use that sits in a drawer at home is more powerful than all the computing power on the planet in the 1950s or the 1960s. It's why in 1958, when IBM bought 100 or so transistors from Fairchild Semiconductor, they paid about $1,000 per transistor, and today a smartphone has tens of billions of transistors in it. So we're familiar with that march within computing. I apologize for the emoji that has not shown up in the square. That is a DNA helix. But we're also seeing within the world of biology, new biological technologies that are getting dramatically cheaper. So when we first sequenced a human genome about 20 years ago, it cost around $1 billion. And today we can sequence genomes for a couple of $100. And we're doing this with aplomb all around the world as we do these PCR tests, and we sort of get work with those technologies. The consequence of technologies in the biological domain, whether it is genome sequencing or it is synthesizing new genes, or whether it is engineering cells to produce useful outputs, those technologies are all declining in cost, and they're declining faster than the rate of Moore's Law. The third area where we're starting to see rapidly declining costs for technologies is in, that is actually a sun with sunglasses on, is in the field of new energies. So in renewables, whether it's solar or wind or battery storage, we've got technologies that are getting substantially cheaper. And in fact, when I started to write this book and research it in about 2015, 2016, solar power had just got to a point where at about half of the world, it was the cheapest form of generating electricity. And the exponential age moves faster than the printing industry, the publishing industry. By the time the book was published, Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimated that in every part of the world, it was cheaper to generate electricity from solar than by using fossil fuels. And that there are reasons which I'll go into as to why that price decline is happening, but we're seeing it happen within energy storage technologies as well. And the final general purpose technology that I think makes up the four elements of the exponential age is manufacturing. We've manufactured things in much the same way for quite a long time. We've chiseled away at them, and now we chisel away at them with computer-controlled devices, or we've casted and we've molded. But there's an emerging technology, additive manufacturing or 3D printing, which has been very, very niche so far. It's in aerospace and medical devices. But it turns out that price performance of 3D printing is improving at about 30% per annum, again on a compounded basis. And so you're getting to the point where this technology may compete with traditional mass manufacturing for large-scale production of components. So those are the four technologies of the exponential age. And the key point here, as I said, is about exponential price performance decline. So what I did on this slide here is to plot what's happened across baselined, essentially back only a few years, to what's happened to certain technologies. So for example, if you look at computing power, it's dropped from $1.50 per gigaflop back in 2001 to about 3 cents per gigaflop back in 2012, and further declines since then. If you look at genome editing, the price has dropped. It's a black line from $1,000 per design, that's designing a gene, through to about $65 by 2020. There's lots more of that in the book itself and in other things I write, but essentially my hard drive is full of Excel spreadsheets with curves like this for different technologies and different data points. So the question then is, what drives those exponential technologies? What is it about them that means their prices decline as much as they do? And I identified really three different factors. The first factor is learning. We often talk about Moore's law, the one that we've all heard of, which is what happens in silicon chips, but there's a more generalized relationship called Wright's law. And there are academics actually at the Martin School, Doyne Farmer, I think, is probably the one who's best known for this, who have done, I think, the most important work in this area to identify that there is a common pattern of learning by doing across a whole field of technologies. What that means is that as we make more of these technologies, we learn how to make them better. The engineers figure out miniature optimizations and sometimes larger optimizations that drives the price down. And this relationship was first observed in 1936 by an engineer called Theodore Wright, and Doyne Farmer and Jessica Tranchik have demonstrated this across dozens of other technologies. And in the exponential age, what I saw building off their work was this learning rate, this idea that the more we produce, the more effectively we produce it, therefore the cheaper it gets. But there were two other things I think that were important in this process. The second was the idea of standardization. So if you look across these technologies, they are increasingly standards driven. That means that you can take a technology that not only is it a general purpose technology in an economic sense, but from an engineering perspective, it can be lifted from one domain into another domain. And that standardization has a couple of effects. It drives up the number of use cases. So it drives up the potential demand, which improves your learning. And in that demand, you also generate more sort of economic value, which allows a sort of reinvestment. And so you see markets expand very, very rapidly. And a really good example of this is what happened within the satellite industry. So prior to about 2012, the typical satellite that was launched was quite large. It weighed about 2.5 tons. It was expensive to build, expensive to put up there, and if something went wrong, you had like a double-decker bus that was doing nothing other than orbit the Earth. But in about 2011, some space researchers out of the US came up with a standard for building what was known as a CubeSat, using standard components, standard batteries, standard chips, standard sort of 4-inch bus. And that allowed a commonality in the way in which we made satellites. And there has been, again, another one of these graphs that ticks up in the number of satellites that are being launched. And with that, a dramatic decline for businesses to access the capabilities of satellites, whether it's to take photos of the Earth or whether it's to do distance communication. So standardization has been an important driver. And the third thing that's been an important driver has been globalization. I mean, essentially creating much faster feedback loops and much larger markets for technologies. We've talked about technologies, and one of the things that I was interested in is, does this get reflected in real outcomes? And I look at this in a lot of different lenses in the book, but just one example here is the technologies are declining. The companies that are built on them are making use of these technologies. Does that lead to faster outcomes? So if you look at the data I show here, which is the revenues of Facebook and ByteDance, which owns TikTok, I tracked what happened from the first year that each firm achieved $7 billion in revenues. And Facebook is one of the fastest growing companies in the world. And yet ByteDance grew nearly twice as fast in the 2 years after it first achieved $7 billion in revenue. And that pattern is really, really common across exponential age firms, that the second and third generation firms grow faster, acquire more users more quickly. And so that pattern of exponentiality seems to ripple through. The way I think about this is this idea of how should we think about exponentiality? So at the bottom layer, you've got core technologies, semiconductors, 3D printing, photovoltaic modules. Those things get driven by a kind of innovation rate that is the learning effects that emerge from learning and standardization. You also have applications of those which are also driven by that innovation rate. And above that, you have the deployment of these technologies. And those behave in a slightly different way because obviously there are only 7 billion people on the planet or 8 billion people on the planet. So there's always going to be a maximum market size. So you will see diffusion patterns, right? Traditional diffusion curves that have the S-curve shape that we're very familiar with. So that sort of set up the idea of exponentially improving technologies and how that impacts kind of into the real world. And then my analytic is really this, that the consequences of that exponentiality are the red curve, institutions, norms and expectations, tax codes, free parking and monopoly, and so on are the yellow, and that is the exponential gap. I was trying to write a systems book, a book that looked at many of the aspects of society and the political economy. And so when I looked at the exponential gap, of course you're dealing with things like incumbency and institutional arrangements and norms and informal practices. The way I order that in the book is through these 5 lenses. So markets, where we think about network effects, platforms and intangibles, and one consequence of markets in the exponential age is that you tend to build winner-take-most businesses. It's why when we look at, you can name the biggest search engine, you might be able to name Bing as a second, but I challenge anyone to name the 5th biggest. When you go into the labor markets, you start to see tensions emerge around automation and gig working and algorithmic management that are connected to the scale of the companies in the space of markets. But it's a very nuanced picture. When we look at economic geography, one of my arguments is that the technologies in question are highly localized. I mean, 3D printing is a great example of a very local technology. You don't worry about a supply chain, you worry about printing it there and then. And in fact, 3D printing manufacturers are already pointing out that 3D printing enables tax arbitrage because you don't have to worry about customs duties and VAT in different regions. And so when I look at the gap that emerges, and I think about the conversations I've had with policymakers and with business leaders over the last 5 years, the thing that I spotted was that there wasn't a joined up discussion about what's really happening across the piece. And what I try to do in the book is explain how these underlying technology processes lead to gaps in these different domains and what the commonality of the solutions are. My argument is that we need different but quite often overlapping solutions, that there are some common principles that need to emerge for that redesign, but that we do find ourselves at a moment of phase change and wholesale institutional reconceptualization. And so I'll pause there, Ian, if I may, because we can go in lots of directions. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Azeem, for your clarity. There are dozens of different directions we can go in. And as I was reading your great book and taking notes, I suddenly discovered I had about 25 different questions. But let me just begin with a couple. I used to, when I gave talks about exponential, often be confronted by people who said, actually, it's not happening. Mm-hmm. And if you look at, for example, the price of computer chips or the speed of computer chips, there have been dramatic slowdowns, and they're both to do with the physics and the ability to etch at the nano level, and some other constraints, heating and energy constraints. So that computing is no longer exponential. We're lucky if it's arithmetic progression. and that everything else depends on that, the genomics and everything else. And so that this might have been a phase that we've gone through, but we're coming towards the end of it. What do you make of those arguments? And do you think that this exponential gap that I think you've absolutely identified is something that we are just at the beginning of, at the end of? Is this a sustain, is this going to widen and widen? We'll get to the institutions in a minute, but just on the technology front, do you really think that this is exponential, in other words, doubling all the time, and that it's sustainable?
I love that question because I think it's important to be really skeptical about any claim that is wild as that. So I'll start with an anecdotal answer. When I was 7, my family had one camera, which was a Polaroid camera that sort of pushed out these square prints. And when I sent the book to the publishers to press in May 2021, I counted the number of cameras my household owned, and it was 57. There's 4 in each car. There were 2 cars. There were 13 in various CCTV cameras. Every phone had 4 cameras, and there were a whole bunch of phones in my desk drawer. And I think you could go around the world in 1979 or 1980 and say, well, how many cameras will the average home have? And very few people would say 20, let alone 60. I discovered, wrote a little analysis of the fact that we actually throw computers away. If you get a digital pregnancy test, which has a little screen that actually has a small 30-cent disposable computer that is used once, normally in a bathroom, and then chucked in the bin. So we've moved a really, really long way. So sometimes I think there is some disbelief that we have to suspend. So now let me get to the practical physics of what Ian has said. Practical physics is that you're absolutely right. We can't miniaturize on Moore's law, which has been the thing that got us a lot of this exponential improvement. But what's happened in the last few years has been that there's been a tremendous set of breakthroughs in machine learning, which have incredible demands for compute. And so the machine learning engineers have sent a signal back into the industry saying, we need millions of times more compute. And the industry has responded by scaling its capabilities, not through miniaturization, but through what they call system scaling, architectural changes. And so even though the most demanding machine learning models have increased their demands for computation by about a factor of 300 million between 2013 and 2021, which is enormous, the industry has responded, but with chips that aren't using really miniaturized processes, 5 nanometers, which is sort of state of the art, but actually new architectures. And they identified that new architectures and new systems could deliver the exponentiality in computing. And so I know that is only a sort of an evidence-based argument, right, rather than a theoretical argument. But it did, in a sense, address this question that's been lingering over the computer industry for a decade, which is things appear to be slowing down. And I think, yes, in theory, things are slowing down, but in practice, they're not slowing down. And we are seeing faster and faster chips and more compute available for industry.
And on the institutional front, you talk about a very wide range of implications on the technology and society front. Is there any institution at all that you can think of that's managed to keep pace or catch up? I mean, what do you think is the best institution in your mind in this area?
Well, I mean, there are the exponential age companies who've defined these rules, and they figured it out. So I think you can look at the sort of Netflixes and the Ubers as companies that understand that. But if you look outside of those types of firms that are born into the exponential age, what we're looking for are institutions that have been a little bit adaptable and a little bit experimental, and I think a couple come to mind. One of the regulators that figured out the need to experiment a little bit. So I think Britain's Financial Conduct Authority and in Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, both created experimental sandboxes where entrepreneurs and innovators could play around and stretch those boundaries of what the regulations allows. Now, that hasn't necessarily flown into the mainstream day job of the regulator, but I think that's one example. I think the second example is in the area of open data, open access, and open source. Somewhere in that area, you start to see institutional forms that work in the exponential age. And I tell a story of Virological, which was an open access database for sharing virus sequences. It's kind of like Reddit for virologists, which basically nobody visited until December the 30th, 2019, and is now a very popular website. But it's a good example of the type of form that works well in an uncertain and highly changing world. It was effectively a public good that has sort of managed to grow and be useful. And so there are a few things that sit in that category. You could argue that Wikipedia sits in that category. You could argue that preprint services like Archive and SOC Archive also exist in that area. But I think it's mostly a few and far between.
And when you talk about the institutional solutions that'll close this gap, so at the global level, you say we need more international cooperation. Well, we could all agree, but the question is, how does one do that? And at the national level, and maybe that's why your person that didn't like it said you were leftist, that you call for work for cooperatives.
I do, yeah.
Could you talk us through those both of them? I mean, how are these things at the national or the global? I can see why cooperation is the right thing, but how are we actually going to get there?
Yeah.
And what is the solution you're proposing at the national level?
Well, I think at the national level, I might need a couple of minutes for this answer because it's a complicated one. But at the national level, on this sort of question of the sort of geography of the institution, we've defined so much at the national level, and these multinational organizations that are populated by nations. And there is a fractalization, actually, I think, of where that power needs to reside. So if we just go down a level to below the nation state, the future in the exponential age is really going to be bound in cities, right? Cities are going to be bigger. They are going to continue to be the engines of creation. These complex advanced economies need large agglomerations of people who can specialize. And even climate change is going to be felt by cities first, and it's going to be the city mayor that needs to make those decisions. And the technologies of the exponential age enable localization. So the intersection between robotics and genomics and renewable power creates high-intensity vertical urban farms. And so for the first time, actually ever since Jericho, cities could be self-sustaining on an energy and a food basis. Renewable power can be highly decentralized. One of the reasons why South Australia now runs 50-60% solar power, despite a government that's not hugely supportive of that, is that individual homeowners or districts can make those energy supply decisions. So then there's a question of how should the locus of governance and democracy move when the technologies enable local decisions? And you've seen this battle out, for example, in South Africa. I'm wary of treading on your geographical expertise, but you know that Cape Town has tremendous renewable resources, but Eskom, National Power Authority, is probably not the best run energy authority in the world. And there's a battle between national regulations and that idea of local subsidiarity. So I think the first thing that we start to see is that cities become more important, and they need to figure out how that gets turned into democratic accountability and where those decisions get made. And then you have this issue of challenges that are bigger than any nation state. And pandemics, cyber threat, climate change, being sort of three examples. And the question is, are the existing institutions that were largely born out of the Second World War, but not entirely? I mean, the ILO and the ITU long predate by 70 years and 100 years the Second World War. Are they correctly framed to deal with the challenges that we need to deal with? And if you look at what's happened with NATO, for example, NATO has pulled on Article 5 once, which was after the Twin Towers attack, but didn't use Article 5, which is the article that defines mutual support, when Estonia suffered a severe, debilitating cyber attack. And it's quite strange as to the one it chose and the one it didn't choose. So you see something that's misconfigured. So the question then is, what do those international organizations actually need to look like? The first and obvious gap at the table is that much of the public infrastructure that we depend on is run by large companies. So when there is a large cyber attack, it's not the US Air Force or the Danish military that stops a cyber attack. It's Microsoft or Google or Cloudflare. And so one question is, how do you bring these organizations that have parastatal power into that decision-making? The second question is, in an era of where threats and challenges are not necessarily defined by contiguous territory, how do you get people to sit together and work together? And so my suggestion is that to deal with the sort of larger scale piece is that, one, the cooperation starts through a minilateralism, getting together small groups of nations around issues that they can agree on, and from that starting to establish some form of norm that can be taken forward and that other people can then join. And we've started to see a little bit of that in areas like cybersecurity. The harder question, I think, and I'm going to confess I ducked in the book, is what do we do about Microsoft and Google and Amazon, who now operate large parts of public infrastructure? They can't be excluded from the discussion, but equally they have no democratic legitimacy. So I'm open for that, maybe to find an answer.
Yeah. I mean, you make the point in the book that unlike what some others that you cite, like Eric Schmidt and others, say, technology is not neutral, and that question of power relationships and who owns it is absolutely key. But as you say, that's for your next book, right?
Yes.
We have about 15 minutes left, so let's open it up. Clara at the back will tell us if they're online people, and do feel free online to pose your questions too. But let's start in the room. We'll start over here. Sorry, you need to wait for the mic so that the people online can hear too.
Hi, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I'm wondering, what does the exponential technological development do with people and societies, and how can we actually keep the pace? So these technologies are posing tough challenges, and how can we actually govern these so fast technologies? Or rephrasing the question, is there no way around meritocracy?
Can we just collect a few?
Yeah,
You okay?
yeah.
Thank you. I've kind of used what attracted me to come here, as I've used a similar approach to address gender inequalities and the fact that women are being left behind in technology and, yet again, another industry. So my question is, how can we deal with this issue, and similar to the question of involving societies and people?
Okay, we'll take one more. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're showing this exponential gap and showing various technologies that are advancing exponentially. So one interesting question is, why are we not seeing exponential growth of governance technologies or other tools to actually meet this gap?
Is that you behind the mask, Anders? Yeah, from Future Humanity Institute.
Oh, wonderful. Excellent. So should I take this?
Yeah, please.
So, I mean, in particular, thanks for the gender question there. One of the many things that are not written about explicitly in the book, one of them is the gender issue. I thought a lot about it and felt slightly outside of where my research was. But you're absolutely right to identify that traditionally the technology industry has vastly excluded women, and there's a great set of literature on that topic that you no doubt know better than most of us. I think one of the key things comes back to a point that you made, Ian, that I make in the book, which is that the technology industry has for 50 years or more argued that its technologies are neutral and they are deterministic. And so in that argument has been created a media narrative that says we need to allow these technologists to produce, because if they don't, we won't get the technologies that we need to come out of our terrible condition. And I don't think that's correct. I think what technology is intimately bound up with being human. It is the story of our humanity. It's the story of our villages and towns and cities, and that we have to figure out ways, and I hope the book does some part of that, to get people to participate more actively in the questions of either technology development or of governance. And I think one of the starting points really is to, it's not so much a policy starting point, is for people to make the point that these things are happening, whether it's Cathy O'Neill or Caroline Corrado-Perez or Virginia Eubanks, who are some of the scholars in that field, and also to make the point that technology is what people do. It's not just what some people do. So I may be a little bit polemical for the book, but that's roughly where I sit. And on the question of, why don't we see governance technologies emerge? I think, again, partly that has been, certainly in the debate in the UK and the US, governance and policy has not been a sexy area for 50 years. And Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher put the state very much in their place. And so there wasn't that much attention, I think, on those technologies, but we're starting to see a rehabilitation of that. And in the last few years, there has been an emergence of interest in digital governance models and entrepreneurship and innovation in that space. As to why we didn't have it, I really do think, and I argue that in the book, that it relates to the economic consensus of the 1970s and the 1980s that said, the state is a bit too overbearing. And I think that's probably why I got this left-wing comment from the reviewer.
And Anders' comment?
Oh, I thought that was Anders as well,
Yeah, okay.
on governance technology.
Okay.
Yeah. Was that okay for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Clara.
So Andrew online asks, how realistic is it to imagine that institutions will suddenly learn to change quickly and allow the needed overhaul rather than being replaced after a period of institutional resistance?
So that's a really great question. I mean, institutions are not likely to, in wholesale, change very, very rapidly, but rapid changes are possible. The UN was formed in, a matter of weeks, and Bretton Woods, likewise. Obviously, we don't want to get to the conditions where we created the institutions that quickly. So I think there is a balance between the emergence of new institutions and the reformation of older institutions. Where are we seeing new institutions emerge? I think is in areas like cybersecurity, where there's a Cyber Peace Initiative, which is a sort of a multilateral group involving nations and companies, And where are we seeing institutions thinking about how they reinvent themselves? I mean, I think you just have to look at the financial regulators at the moment who are trying to contend with what's happening in decentralized finance or cryptocurrency. They're trying, but they're really struggling. And in my book, I don't look at that in the book, but in my thinking, my sense is that that is one area where we would benefit from those institutions being able to reinvent themselves, but I'm not sure if they will be able to. And to sort of wrap my conclusion on that is slightly inadequate, but it's a combination of new forms that emerge that we can't currently see, cyberpeace being one example, and ones that manage to adapt themselves. And actually, I'll just give you one example that's occurred to me. The OECD's digital tax initiative is a good example of an existing initiative from an existing institution that's come up with something that deals with some of these issues.
The Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations report, now for the long term, also grapples with a lot of these issues if people are interested. Yeah.
Thank you. Have you discussed failure as being one of the reasons for the exponential growth? Because actually, for everything that's adding to the exponent, there's probably 9,999 failures in there, which you can't do with institutions, surely.
Should we take it? Should I just take that one?
Yeah.
I mean, really big issue with experimentation is that many experiments give progress by not giving the result you want, which in some domains is called failure. And again, that comes back to how public institutions have been allowed to behave in the last 40 or 50 years. When we have seen the debate move more rapidly towards efficiency and productivity, and that's what we want from our public institutions, it's very hard for them to go off and say, well, we tried 3 things, 2 of which taught us what not to do, and 1 of which taught us what to do. And I think one of the things that we'll need to do is figure out how we bring some of those disciplines of experimentation into our public life. In the UK, I think there's a little bit of a struggle there because we will have gone through the pandemic and the accountants will go back over things like test and trace, which was a very expensive, not particularly adequate public initiative. And I'm not sure it's going to create any positive arguments to allowing the public sector to experiment. But unfortunately, the public sector will need to experiment because we don't know what the future necessarily looks like. And that, I think, then comes back to political leadership and narrative.
Yeah, and in fact, I think there could be the opposite argument, that the problem is that institutions don't fail, that they're not enough. I mean, I'm not aware of a single UN or global institution that's been closed down in the post-war period in the last 75 years. And that's sclerosis in the system is part of the reason that it hasn't reformed, because there's so much capture from the past. I think. Clara, online.
Pascal has asked, are there environmental concerns with exponentiality?
There are huge environmental concerns. I'll give the bullish story. The bullish story is that exponential technologies allow us to achieve more with less. So if you look at the carbon intensity of advanced economies, it's rapidly declined. In the UK, by 2019, to generate £1 in GDP, we needed about between 2.8 and 2.9 times less CO2 than we did in 1986. So we are getting more for less pollution. And many of the technologies that are being built on these 4 will achieve that. They'll be more sustainable. They will replace dirty industrial processes like the Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen with more elegant and refined processes. However, there's always the problem of what's known as the rebound effect. And the rebound effect, British economist Jevons talked about 150 years ago. I lived while I was writing my book. I ran out of bookshelf space, so I bought another bookshelf. And then I had a bookshelf that was full of books and books all over my desk, so I put another bookshelf and on we go. So it doesn't contend the sort of increasing power of these technologies and the fact that they can give us more for less don't contend with the problem that we continue to fill our boots and sort of overconsume. And those are issues around ultimately policies that nations or cities implement and values that we hold. And I don't think we can expect, and we shouldn't expect the technologies to solve that problem.
And some of the technologies themselves are also very energy intensive, like computer farms.
Well, the technologies are energy intensive, but I think the question is it cheaper to simulate 1,000 trucks driving across the UK delivering Christmas presents than to run 1,000 trucks 1,000 times around the UK to figure out what the best route is? And I mean, in silico, simulation is much, much less energy intensive, and the energy system is decarbonizing, and most data centers are run on renewable power. So the bigger problem in my book is actually that those optimizations that we get by running things in silico create cheaper products that we buy much, much more of, and there's the pollution.
Okay, we've got time for 2 quick questions, I think. Carl, all right, 3 quick questions. Carl, you and you. Sorry, you're not going to get in, and then we'll end up.
One of the probably fastest institutional responses I can think of was in response to 9/11, when the NSA developed a rather vast surveillance program under the sort of below the public radar. And I guess it sort of raises the question, are democratic countries sort of less well placed to deal with some of the issues of the exponential age relative to autocratic regimes, and that's something you worry about?
Yeah.
Do you think it's wise to act sooner rather than later when it comes to tempering the exponential advancement of things like genetic technologies before they become an existential threat to our civilization? And when is the kind of inflection point when that becomes a place where we can't ever retrieve our kind of humanity?
Thank you for your talk. At the very beginning, you mentioned an interesting connection between institutions and basic human nature and the human ability to predict and process problems. But for the rest of your book, the rest of this talk, it was primarily a conversation between technologies and institutions, but not quite addressing the human nature underneath all of that. How do you believe your solutions, or any solution in the future, would actually go to that level, to actually bring us closer to solving some of these problems?
Great, thank you.
And the final question was?
So, gentleman over here. I'll be quick. Yes, I will.
This relates to the first question. So you point that we need this big push in the rate of change of our institutions, and that's very welcome. But then the means you talk about achieving that are very congenial. They, more international cooperation, more cooperatives and so on. And we know those things, even if they get a boost, are going to be linear. So it looks like there's going to be a gap that persists. And I wonder whether you think that will just create a crisis, or will it get to the stage where our institutions start constraining the growth of the exponential technologies?
Great, thank you so much. So on those first couple of questions, for the first and the last, so we'll start there. What we have seen, of course, is China, in a variety of different ways, act very, very quickly. Over this summer, after I published the book, the thing to think about there was that if you think about how far the Chinese regime allowed Alibaba and many of these other technology entrepreneurs to go in accumulating power. and the degree to which that would have presented an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party, that really let them go quite far, because they knew they could act quickly, and they did. And many of the steps they took, we can argue with the democratic accountability, we can argue with the mechanism of the steps they took to pin back the power of those companies and to tighten regulations around them. The actual detail of the substance of the regulations don't look that bad in reality, right? But we have slower mechanisms here. So it seems to be that China, which is not just authoritarian, it also has really, really deep expertise. I mean, the Chinese policymakers I've met, and I'm sure you've met many yourself, Carl, really know and understand these issues. I think it provides a governance advantage. I'm not sure it's necessarily just about the authoritarian nature. I think it's about the expertise that lives within the politicians and the policymakers. And to the other gentleman's question, which I've slightly forgotten. Constraining. Yeah, pardon me. You know, we can identify large organizations that are complex and adaptable in their approaches. And so you just have to look at the scale of a Google or a Facebook. Even if Google today is much less good at its dynamic decision-making than it was 15 years ago, it's still better than, say, any part of the civil service. And the question is, can those methodologies make their way across into those institutions in the right period of time, and to what extent is that driven by underlying technologies? To what extent is it delivered by dependent on the talent within those groups? So I don't think it's inevitable that those institutions can't improve. I think part of my diagnosis is that they've been asking the wrong questions about the landscape. And I'll just share one sort of example, is that if you talk to, I make an argument that we need to have more worker cooperatives, call them trade unions. But if you talk to politicians about that question, it brings rise not to gig workers trying to organize for better terms, but to striking industrial workers outside of a car plant. And so I think that those things can change if you change the underlying belief pattern internally, but I agree it's not easy. The other two questions which related to, I've now forgotten them, sorry. This is a problem with having 4 questions. Genetics, yes, that's right. Yeah.
Genetics and humans and society.
Humans and society, that's what I've written there, genetics, yeah. So if we go back to this question, I think a large part of that is to do with engagement early on with the issues. And genetics has been, I think, quite successful, because early on, starting in the UK with the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, we started to talk about those issues. And if we can change the narrative and engage with those questions much, much earlier on, then we are in a position to establish the right sorts of things that societies ought to be arguing for. And I know that sounds a bit waffly, but I'm mindful of the fact we've got someone from FHI here, and we've got Carl here, who authored a very well-cited survey, which in many cases were misinterpreted by the popular media, because I don't think we had done enough broad engagement with society. And to the question about humans, one of the reasons why we argue that humans don't contend with these types of changes is because we don't see them in the real world. The question is whether that is a skill that can be taught, and whether that type of thinking can make its way into our education system and into behaviors. And actually, I think that can be taught. The idea of dealing with uncertainty, dealing with rapid change, but it's just that it's not taught and hasn't been.
Azeem, thank you so much. We could go on, and I'm very keen to, but we've constrained ourselves to an hour. So let's stop. Thanks to all the online audience. You can't get Azeem to sign your book here, but do buy it online nevertheless. And to those that are here, if you want to carry on your conversation with Azeem and have him sign your book, they're for sale at the back, and I highly recommend It's issues we've just touched on in this conversation are gone into in much greater depth in the book, and I do recommend it to you. Thanks so much for coming and being with us this evening. It's a bit cold in here. I hope you aren't all too cold, but thank you so much for coming out on this evening, and good evening to all of you.
Thank you.